So our next speaker is Sarah Gunawan. Sarah received her Master's of Architecture and Bachelor of Architectural Studies from the University of Waterloo. Her thesis, entitled Synanthropic Suburbia, examined the interface between humans and animals within prototypical North American suburbs and proposed a series of prosthetics to the single-family house which created opportunities for cohabitation. Sarah's current research investigates the multi-species ecology of urban parks in the city of Toronto through analytical core sample drawings. She is also a designer for Lateral Office, an experimental design practice that operates at the intersection of architecture, landscape, and urbanism, focusing on powerful design relationships between public realm, infrastructure, and the environment. Please welcome Sarah.
The work I'm presenting today is part of my Master's of Architecture thesis, which I completed at the University of Waterloo. I'm not nearly as tall as Marcus. Good. The project explores how architecture can generate positive effects within the urban ecosystem by engaging the tensions that arise when human and non-human species cohabitate. Through a series of design experiments, the work investigates how small-scale architectural interventions can influence large-scale territorial patterns. The objective is to challenge human perceptions of animal cohabitation within the site of greatest tension, the domestic realm of the house, and in a place of rapid ecological transformation, the North American suburb. I approached research and design by first examining the smallest scale, which is the animal, which provided the foundation for expanding architectural, community, and territorial scale strategies. The objective is to test how the proliferation of small-scale interventions could have productive ecological impact at wider scales. The presentation is structured into 4 parts, which reflect this methodology. Culturally, humanity defines animals by their relationships to humans, categorizing them into mostly 2 forms: domestic, dependent on humans for survival and augmented to live as companion species, and wild, independent of humans, capable of sustaining life without anthropogenic support. However, as civilization urbanizes and animals invade, the conceptual division between city and nature begins to dissolve. Society is gradually relinquishing absolute definitions of human and animal relationships to allow for gradients between complete reliance and total independence. The synanthropic condition, which people mentioned yesterday, lies within this emerging gradient. It defines species which are between the domestic and the wild who benefit from living in close proximity to humans, yet remain beyond their control. Synanthropes are animals that have adapted to the patterns of transformation, consumption, and production exhibited by human civilizations. As a result, these opportunistic species have thrived and proliferated alongside human geographic expansion. Synanthropic species are the most abundant in city landscapes, as we were learning yesterday, where they learn to occupy the streets, buildings, and infrastructural systems established and inhabited by humans. Messier-Chluniak defines this process of adaptation as synurbization, the adjustment of wild animal populations to urban environments. Cities offer a habitat with reduced predation risk, protection from climatic stresses, and year-round food abundance for many species. Their anthropogenic condition also alters species behaviors, creating novel conditions which encourage them to act with ingenuity and ultimately provide habitat opportunities within these ecosystems. Human interactions with animals are influenced by their perception of the species. The factors of control and perception are intrinsically tied and mutually inflect each other. One's perception towards a species informs the degree to which they aspire to control it. Inversely, the established level of control between us and the other influences our perception towards it. So take these scenarios, for example. The bird in the backyard, separated from the human by a physical boundary, is considered a source of entertainment. If the same bird enters the house, control is lost, and it is suddenly perceived as an intruder. Once the bird is contained within a cage, however, it transforms into a beloved pet. But what happens when the bird occupies the boundary between the domestic and wild, establishing novel conditions of cohabitation? So the work I'm looking largely sits within that kind of last realm and tries to explore that question. Together, the factors of control and perception define the limits of synanthropic space, in which the relationship between human and non-human species coexists. The potential of synanthropic design, therefore, exists in the thickening and multiplication of physical interfaces between human and animal, to create an urban environment which is intentionally inclusive. Embracing that logic, building systems could create inhabitable spaces within inhabitable spaces at the outside of environmental closures. Infrastructures could establish productive frameworks which employ species and its ecosystem services, and in turn, operative frameworks would ask humans to engage with and even encourage cohabitation with synanthropic species. Synanthropic architecture could change human perceptions of cohabitation. It could invite new species to adapt to the city, supporting them through this urbanization process. In the future, everyone, both human and animal, will have a right to become citizens of these cities. So these provocations provided the foundation for my work, which encourages synergization through architectural design in an effort to promote cohabitation in the suburbs. So the first part, between subjects, reframes the animal as a potential cohabitant of the suburban ecosystem alongside humans. The objective is to engage the biological and environmental needs of the animal into the design of the shared environment. So my research into animals led me to school as well, and the theory of the Umwelt, which we discussed yesterday, and that describes a perceptual world in which an organism occupies, their self-centered world. So for me, as an architecture student, the idea that an animal had a different biological conditions which caused them to perceive space differently was really fascinating. That motivated a series of drawings which tried to understand that in a sort of pseudo-architectural sense. So rats, for example, have poor vision, high sensitivity to light, and see the world in dichromatic color. So as a result, the rat occupies a very tactile, not tactical, relying on a sense of touch through its whiskers for orientation. So this drawing shows that for the rat, the urban environment is perceived as a network of edges, masked in shadows where heightened smells serve to guide it towards sustenance and shelter. Alternatively, that same space for the pigeon is viewed through a wide monocular vision and in pentachromatic color. So the built environment registers as a series of ledges for perching and open surfaces for scavenging from. The peregrine falcon, alternatively, is a recently urban adapted species, and the city is a space of plateaus and canyons created by the urban fabric. So while the work that follows doesn't specifically engage these species, it definitely was informed by this sort of earlier study of ideas of the Umwelt. So based on this research, I began looking at how human and animal species perceive the same built environment and how that informs their habitation of it, so specifically within the suburbs. So animals often perceive the volume of the building environment as an opportunity to nest and reproduce. Meanwhile, for humans, the exterior boundary of their house defines their domain, which is vulnerable to invasion by non-human species. So there are two types of animal and habitation that often occur, especially within the suburbs. One is at the building interface, and it's a migratory species who overwinter in warmer climates tend to occupy surfaces at the perimeter of the house. For example, various bird species and bats will find shelter under soffits, on ledges, in vents, and even beneath cladding. The other type is more towards rodents, some birds, and larger mammals who require sheltered spaces to survive the winter and will often seek out volumetric interfaces. So any vulnerabilities in the building enclosure, such as chimneys, vents, and soffits, provide these species with a point of entry into heated spaces beyond. So this project tries to reimagine these usually very banal and conventional architectural components into new forms of prosthetics, which create ecological opportunities that also attempt to kind of mediate the human-animal relationship. So these three prosthetics serve 6 animal species, which were selected, and some of them are already synanthropes, some of them are species that have the potential to adapt to a suburban environment, and some were previously synanthropic and have changed because of different design conditions. And ultimately, the design speculations seek to shift the conceptual limits of human territory to enable cohabitation within a suburban house. So the first prosthetic seeks to restructure human relationships with the common raccoon, which is obviously a medium-sized nocturnal creature notorious for its ingenuity and dexterous paws, which allows it to gain access to green bins, as we were learning from Suzanne yesterday. The nightly disturbances and unsightly messes that raccoons leave behind is often a nuisance for most homeowners. So instead of lamenting their abilities, the compost chimney somewhat optimistically seeks to productively employ them. The popularity of the glass fireplace has rendered the conventional domestic chimney obsolete, and so the design reappropriates the form of the chimney into a permanent composting system. Food waste is inserted into the compost container from the inside of the house, where it then undergoes a 3-stage process. The digestion and circulation stage is actually executed by the raccoon, who rotates an external gear, turning an interior conveyor belt. In exchange for their labor, the raccoon receives a morsel of food dispensed from the wage tube. Meanwhile, the upper volume of the chimney provides a protected habitat for the second species. So the chimney swift, which we also discussed yesterday, are unique birds whose sporadic flight patterns and inability to perch differentiated from many other species. Historically, the cigar-shaped birds have found refuge in masonry chimneys where they attach twig nests to the interior walls. However, with the transition toward electric heating and gas fireplaces, the chimney is no longer a fixture of suburban houses, which has led to a decline. So the framed upper volume of the chimney provides a habitat protected from raccoons by a chimney cap. Heat generated from the decomposition process is ventilated upwards into the cavity to extend the shoulder seasons for the bird, and the homeowner is provided with rich nutrient compost to help fortify their domestic ecosystem. The second prosthetic engages 2 avian species. Through a series of misconceptions, the eastern bluebird was and continues to often be perceived as an at-risk species despite relatively stable populations. Over the last few decades, bird advocates have formed numerous societies for the promotion and protection of eastern bluebirds, installing specifically constructed nest boxes to support them. Eastern bluebirds are valued for their aesthetic appearance and as voracious consumers of pestilent insects. Tree swallows share numerous qualities with bluebirds and often elect to occupy the same bird boxes. The greatest difference between the 2 species is that tree swallows are often not culturally perceived as of concern, when in reality they're often at far greater risk than their counterpart. But as a result, bluebird advocates often destroy tree swallow nests if they're discovered in bluebird designated bird boxes. So this further obviously hinders the population of tree swallows. However, people have also discovered that both species are highly territorial. However, when nesting spaces is properly coupled, as in 2 bird boxes are paired side by side on the same post, that they'll actually successfully cohabitate. So the idea with the extended eave prosthetic engages this inter-species dynamics in order to provide viable habitat for both species. It merges water mitigation systems with exhaust vents to create extended season habitat for both bluebirds and tree swallows. The system uses extended planting beds to increase rainwater capacity and reduce risk of buildup within the gutters. For humans, the extended eave enhances the aesthetic and ecological value of the house while encouraging desirable avian species who serve as natural pest control. So the idea is during the colder months that excess heat from the house would radiate from your dryer would be vented upwards into this to provide kind of warm space and even melt some of the snow that often builds up and causes our ice damming, which is a really bad architectural process that often happens. So I went through different variations of this idea, thinking about different species. So the first ones were bluebirds and tree swallows, and then afterwards I was like, what if it was for a goldfinch, which is another kind of native species in North America? And so I actually ended up building a kind of 1-to-1 mock-up of it as part of my thesis, just to test both fabrication as well as sort of to see how big this thing actually was. Then the last prosthetic is for the barn owl, is the first. So it incorporates habitats for 2 species with pest control capabilities, the barn owl and the brown bat. Previously, barns were designed to provide nesting habitat specifically for barn owls. In exchange, the birds of prey consumed and controlled abundant rodent populations on farms. With changes in agrarian practices, rodenticide replaced owls as a prominent form of pest control, and as a result, barn owl populations have declined. Within a suburban context, barn owls have the potential to serve the same ecological service if they're provided with adequate nesting sites, access to open space, subdued noise and lighting conditions to enable night hunting. So brown bats, as we learned yesterday, and from both Joyce and Lisa, are the most common bat in Canada. However, due to white nose syndrome, populations are declining. So previously, these bats could also find shelter in drafty barns and attics, or even beneath cladding material. However, as building enclosure systems become more sealed off, they're no longer able to provide habitat opportunities. So despite negative cultural perception, bats make for beneficial neighbors as their diets consist predominantly of mosquitoes. So the typical form of the dormer is reimagined to provide additional real estate for the barn owl, the brown bat, and the human. formally extends the language of the multi-peak roofs, which are widely marketed to suburban homebuyers as desirable features. Roof exhaust vents are embedded into the system, ensuring they are protected from animal infiltration, which often happens, while providing heat to the next box. So, the surface area of the dormer is wrapped in a bat wall cladding system, which is comprised of textured wood surfaces slotted together. It provides a variety of depths and textures, which the bat can occupy at different times of the day. Within the volume of the dormer, the homeowner gains enough square footage for an additional bedroom, study, or playroom, thereby increasing the home's real estate as well as ecological value. So again, I kind of tried to test some of these ideas through small-scale studies, and then a kind of one-to-one section of the bat wall, which I then actually attached to my brother's house in Kitchener. He was there too. I traded babysitting services for that. So from there, the prosthetics are designed to take advantage of the highly regular structural systems and enclosure methods utilized by suburban developers, and therefore can be deployed across a multitude of house design models. The objective is for the synanthropic prosthetic to invade the suburbs, multiplying across neighborhoods to generate significant ecological impact through the repetition of a somewhat small intervention. So this is a Greystone 3 model, which is produced by Starling, which is a big developer in Toronto. So they present the house as a kind of sitting on a very lush green lawn, surrounded by a lot of trees, when in reality this is the exact same model in a suburb just north of Markham. So it's not a very viable habitat at first. But the synanthropic prosthetics try to situate themselves in a way that they could kind of provide first opportunities for species to start to colonize. Okay, I'm going to start to go quicker because I'm running behind. So the third part, Synurban assemblages, expands in scale to contemplate the landscape ecology of the suburbs. In Canada, suburbs are a pervasive condition that occur at the peripheral edges of major metropolitan areas. Over 2/3 of Canada's population live in some form of suburb, which function as borderlands between conflicting anthropogenic and ecological pressures. So I used a lot of the principles from Richard Foreman of landscape ecology, which define landscapes as a series of patches, corridors, and matrices, which assemble to create diverse habitats. So using his language, I tried to develop my own about suburbs. So of course the house is the kind of basic building block, which is then multiplied and creates a kind of expanded matrix that provides like the background to any suburban ecosystem. And then patch types, unlike natural ecosystems, are much more like golf courses and parks and schoolyards, and take on different forms but still have potential to support ecosystems. And then corridors are highways, major roads, minor roads, railways, and ravines, which serve to connect or disconnect different areas. So this is actually north of Toronto. This is Markham. It's actually, I think, Unionville part of Markham, for those who are familiar. And this kind of provided a prototypical landscape in which to consider these. So some of the major issues, the anthropogenic processes which generate those suburban matrices are often produce fragmented and discontinuous landscapes. So the project tries to address 3 issues. First, the conventional fabric of suburban blocks, particularly at the beginning of their development, are not very capable of supporting diverse species, occupation, and migration. Second issue is the conflict between human and animal vectors of movement. Major highways and arterial roads bisect natural corridors and restrict animal movement and pose a threat to urban animals. And the third issue is how patterns of human development fragment existing habitat patches, reducing the viability of landscape to support their diverse animal habitation. So each of the next sort of medium-scale typologies strategically fortifies the background ecological matrix by providing available habitat and increasing connectivity between existing patches and corridors. So this is taking the same 3 prosthetics and trying to apply a sort of larger scale strategy. When the community is first developed, a corridor setback is established from their backyard of their lot to define space for ecological growth, which is then the compost chimney over time adds waste produced by homeowners to the corridor, improving the quality of the soil and allowing for the densification of planting. So this essentially supplants fencing, like you wouldn't have partitions between property lines. When replicated across the block, the connectivity corridor produces a path of circulation for non-humans. Homeowners seeking privacy begin extending the planting from the central corridor to create lateral connections between backyards. So the other idea is to encourage densification of the corridor. Homeowners are often offered incentives to reduce their building footprint. And for every 15% of reduction, you could say that homeowners are able to add a story. So you would increase the amount of land available. The central connectivity corridor combined with transverse paths starts to create a mesh of circulation throughout the backyard suburban matrix. And the matrix could support animal movement, foraging, and inhabitation throughout the landscape. So you could imagine your backyard, oh, that is super dark, could start to look something like that at night. Just dark. So the principles of the extended eave prosthetic are modified to create 3 variations, each of which support different bird species and generate distinct street frontages. So a single type of extended eave prosthetic could be deployed across a whole community scale patch to establish a unique species-based identity for a neighborhood. So the bird bath eave variation, the house could be situated closer to the street to promote the presence of birds to the community. Composted soil generated by the chimney could be used to support the growth of plants and provide winter food for the birds. Alternatively, another variation tuned for the goldfinch would have a branching structural system to support extended planter while providing appropriate nesting sites below. But for the bobolink, who actually nests in the ground, the eave could actually instead collect rainwater and filter it into the landscape below. So the synurban typologies assemble to establish a new synanthropic landscape. Animal movement blocks create a network of backyard circulation. Patch communities define diverse structured habitats, and as a result, the habitat dormer is installed to capitalize on the vibrant landscape that has been created. Last scale. So expanding synurbanization, it speculates on the potential for holistic planning of synanthropic suburbs by leveraging legislative planning acts and official city plans. It tests the potential of synanthropic design by strategically applying the synurban typologies onto a prototypical landscape. So the objective is not only to fortify existing systems, but to cultivate new ecological opportunities within a suburban biome. So again, this is Unionville in Markham, and this is sort of their amenities map. So they kind of have these green corridors that they're maintaining, and then sort of the insertion of an entirely new community. So that's the same map. And the first strategy, let's see. So the first strategy is a boundary offset from the existing, the objective is first to establish a synurban zone, that's the stage 1. Second, to improve the quality and connectivity of the landscape by developing transverse connections. And finally, create new opportunities through the development of diverse patches. So this is the establishment of the synurban zone. So it's essentially offsetting a boundary of the existing greenway system. And if they were to add that to the official plan as a synurban zone, so blocks within this boundary are ecologically appropriated as part of the greenway system, forming a hybrid landscape. The compost chimney is deployed onto every house within the synurban zone to improve the soil quality, and property owners could be incentivized to construct reduced footprint single-family homes in order to give over more of their land to the greenway system. Homeowners would become stewards of their own backyard and contribute to the fortification of the existing ecological systems. The second strategy creates transverse corridors between the existing north-south system. This increases the overall security of the network, allowing animals to circumnavigate the perils of the road network, gain access to greater territory, and connect to larger habitat patches. So the third strategy defines patch communities, which operate as stepping stones between larger patches. Each community is designed to provide habitat for certain avian species through the use of the extended eave prosthetic. Targeted species are selected based on proximity to existing foraging patches, such as natural vegetation, parks, playgrounds, agricultural fields, commercial areas, and greenway corridors. So the synanthropic prosthetics and synurban typologies essentially merge and are implemented and multiplied across conventional suburban landscape to generate gradients of ecological diversity and viability. Okay, that's the last one. Across each scale of intervention, the design strategies attempt to negotiate human and animal interaction to create a network system of cohabitation. I believe it's important to operate at multiple scales when designing for the ecology of the urban and suburban environment. And I hope the architectural profession can continue to expand the design process to engage issues of our non-human neighbors and the making of our urban environment. Cool.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. So we'll open the floor to questions. Justin, I think you had your hand up immediately.
Yeah, I think this is a great a great kind of way to start thinking about things. I'm wondering about how you begin to think about this traded off against other values. So you might see the backyard and this wild-looking corridor, and then imagine that from a perspective of someone who's worried about crime as a perfect escape route. And you know, so there's safety issues, and then like trade-offs with other things like urban farming, which you know, if you're working on providing habitat for these species, then you're not going to be using that space to grow food for humans. Trade-offs with walkability, and then also, you know, what we know about raccoons, you know, and what we heard yesterday, we may not want to be rewarding raccoons for coming around. I didn't necessarily have to be the one to say it. There's a row in front of me that I brought that up otherwise. So I'm just, you know, I really think it's cool, but I think, you know, this is a good start to a conversation about how we make these deliberations.
I mean, I think the work very much like came from those early drawings of species, which I'm going to fly back to. But those provided kind of very much a foundation for everything that I thought. So like right from the beginning, it was this, and then this motivated a lot of the work. So of course, there's kind of a skewed perception then towards an animal thinking more so than potentially some of those human factors that feed back into it. So I think that has definitely colored the research and the way I functioned, because I think it was a challenge for an architect to not think about the sort of human. And actually my thesis advisor kept being like, so what do humans get out of this? It was always kind of the question back of like, what do they get out of that? And I think that's something that as we're designing for species, there's always that kind of negotiation. Part of this was also to kind of provoke a kind of wider thinking of like, well, instead of just thinking of new ways for the green bin, could we actually think of it as part of a larger ecosystem, that it could be contributing, maybe instead of the corridor, everyone says it's actually, that could be in a community decision to say that's an agricultural area, and all the compost then goes and supports that. I think there's equal viability towards those kind of questions, but yeah.
I think it's fantastic. I love the project, and it's amazing, and I think we should talk more about it. I'm curious though. I guess I had a couple comments. One, how do you? Your system seems kind of sort of very specific to a certain location, locale, style of living, and I'm curious if you thought about how it might apply to other different sort of ecological regions, and also if there's maybe a more sort of urban sort of solution that, you know, if it's percolating in your mind. So that was kind of one kind of question or response. I'm kind of curious if you feel that there's a certain amount of openness to some of these designs that we need to kind of keep in mind as well. That as an architect, I know it's sometimes quick or easy to identify problems to solve or to find sort of solutions, right? And, I think probably from what, and I'm sorry that I missed yesterday's presentation with raccoons and other animals, that there's obviously kind of an area of unpredictability and sort of uncontrollability that's associated with all this life. And if there isn't, I mean, your solutions are amazing and they're imaginative, and they, I also love the way you paired animals together, the raccoon and the swift, and the owl and the bat. I mean, there's a level of like co-working and cohabitation sort of going on here, and it's all really kind of very idealistic in a way, but great, and I love it. But I wonder if there might be a way to sort of step back in a sense and allow more unpredictability, or do you think that's a good strategy? If you think there's, if it might be beneficial to sort of pull back a little bit on the solution providing or not, I don't know, maybe it's a topic for a larger conversation.
I think as I was doing these, and I think anytime you're sort of working with species, it's always the question of how do you pick first? Like how do you select those species? And so that was a kind of delayed my start of actually designing, because that decision-making process is really hard. But I think the effort with coupling species was also to say, though there are objectives or targeted species, that there's a kind of openness to say, the barn owl dormer, though it has certain dimensions, though it's sort of towards a certain species, there's also an understanding that it could very well either A, never be occupied, or B, be occupied by something entirely unexpected.
Yeah.
So there was always this kind of understanding that there is no way to control the ecology of the area and how species start to inhabit. But I think Joy said this the other day, she's like, you just want to do something,
Yeah.
you just want to sort of start. And so this was the sort of first stab, but I kind of always imagine these things as like, maybe not this one's because it's a kind of larger scale intervention, but something like this, I sort of imagine like you could buy a Home Depot.
Yeah.
It could be a unitized.
That's my third question.
Yeah.
Have you actually tried to monetize any of this? I mean, are you working on patents and like distributing this to like Petco? Because I mean, that would be a really quick way to test some of these ideas. Like, is to actually take it very seriously and start a Kickstarter campaign and see if anybody catches it.
Right. Yeah. I have not. I think that was part of building them was to sort of see and to learn. And I think this got built at like the 11th hour before my thesis defense, and it was like, okay, does it actually work? What would it be made out of? And this thing is super heavy. So like, right off the bat, there's like lessons learned of like, it should really be made out of metal, but is that actually good for species? So I think it would require a lot of further investigation, but it's something I would consider.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
I see there are a few questions at the front, but I'm going to ask for a question at the back here, and we'll return to your questions after Brad has presented. So yes, final question for Sarah right now.
Oh, okay. Just wanted to say that I love that you were thinking of different stages of the building. So not only the eaves trough and the extra sort of barn owl bat habitat, which could be added after a building is built, but also like looking at incentivizing homeowners. And so many people, especially in the suburbs, like buy the houses before they're finished, that you could add an extra story and increase the green space around it. So I thought that was very interesting. But I was just wondering, I personally love the idea because I like sort of ragged wildness everywhere, but this suburbs is very sort of sanitized place or Disney-fied place. And have you started thinking about how you will sort of market this to suburb architects or development firms and to include that as something that they can offer their people buying their houses?
Well, I think largely the effort with them, they're fairly subtle in a way in terms of like, they took less the position of like, I'm going to promote species and the presence of species. It was more so an effort to say, okay, not only are you introducing animals to cohabitate closely with humans, which is like a challenging thing in the first place, you're also introducing new types of architecture. So they were somewhat intentionally subtle. Like the dormer very specifically picked up on like designs in which houses have these like multiple dormers because that's like an aesthetic thing that people like and and it's sort of promoted to them. So there was definitely an effort in that to say, to keep them within a kind of suburban language, but then also to say like, maybe the dormer is too much for you, but you could pick bat wall siding for your house as like the front of your house, because homeowners are given those sort of limited range of options as to the finishes. But you could pick like, pay the slate premium, you get the bat wall siding, or you get the certain types of vegetation support siding that feeds different species. But I think there's an ability to kind of break the thing apart and sort of, reduce the intensity maybe at first until there's maybe a wider cultural acceptance of these kinds of things. But it's definitely